For most of my adult life, I was never alone. That isn't something I would have said proudly when I was younger. Back then, being alone sounded like freedom to some people. Independence, space, silence that belonged only to you. But I married young, and I married once, and from that moment on, my life was shared in ways I didn't even notice at the time. Not because it was loud or dramatic, but because it was steady. I met my wife when I was 22. I was working a job I didn't plan on keeping forever, in a town I thought I would eventually leave. She was visiting a friend. We met in a place neither of us expected to matter long-term, which is often how the most permanent things begin. She had a laugh that arrived before her words did. Not loud, not forced, just easy, familiar even when it was. We talked that afternoon longer than we meant to, about ordinary things, where we grew up, what we thought we wanted, what we hadn't figured out yet. There was nothing dramatic about it, no lightning strike, no certainty. Just a quiet sense, even then, that being near her felt natural. We built a life the way most people do, one decision at a time, rarely stopping to look at the whole picture. Jobs came and went. We moved houses. We raised children. We argued about money and schedules and things that didn't matter as much as they felt like they did at the time. Through it all, there was an understanding between us that didn't need to be spoken. When one of us was tired, the other picked up the slack. When one of us worried, the other steadied things. When one of us dreamed, the other listened. And we did dream. There was a place we talked about for years, sometimes casually, sometimes seriously. A destination that lived more in conversation than on any calendar. "We'll go someday," she would say. "When things slow down," I'd reply. That phrase, "when things slow down," followed us for decades. When the kids are older. When work settles. When the house is paid off. When we're not so busy. Someday always felt responsible, sensible, mature. We were good at postponing joy in practical ways. Then time did what it always does. It moved forward without consulting us. The children grew up and moved on. Work became something I endured more than enjoyed. Retirement arrived not with excitement, but with confusion. Suddenly the days were open, and we didn't quite know how to fill them. We talked about the trip again. "Soon," we said. Then she got sick. It wasn't sudden, not at first. It crept in quietly, disguised as fatigue, a little forgetfulness, shortness of breath she tried to laugh off. Doctors' appointments became part of our routine, then specialists, then words neither of us liked hearing. Through it all she remained herself, calm, practical, braver than I was. I became her companion in a new way, her driver, her note-taker, her quiet anchor when the world began to feel unstable. There were moments, late at night, when she was asleep and I was awake, when I thought about the trip again, about how ridiculous it felt to have waited so long, about how fragile someday suddenly seemed. But I didn't say it out loud. Some dreams feel selfish when survival takes over. She died on a Tuesday morning. No dramatic farewell, no perfect last sentence, just a slow quiet that filled the room and refused to leave. Afterward, people told me I was strong. I didn't feel strong, I felt hollow. The days after the funeral blurred together. Cards, casseroles, conversations that circled the same phrases. "If you need anything. She's in a better place. You're not alone." Then, gradually, everyone went back to their lives. And I was alone. The house changed after she died. Not physically, everything stayed where it had always been, but the silence grew heavier, not peaceful, expectant. I caught myself listening for sounds that never came. Her cough from the bedroom, the clink of a spoon in a mug, the television turned down too low. I kept my routines, because abandoning them felt like another kind of loss. I woke up at the same time, made coffee for one, pouring it into the mug she used to prefer, sat at the kitchen table and stared out the window longer than necessary. Some days passed easily, others didn't pass at all. They just sat with me unmoving. Friends encouraged me to get out, to stay busy, to distract myself. But grief doesn't disappear when you stay busy. It just waits until you're alone again. One afternoon, months later, I opened a drawer we had both avoided for years. Not because it was painful, but because it held things we hadn't sorted yet. Old papers, receipts, odds and ends from a life layered over itself. At the bottom of the drawer, folded carefully, was a travel brochure. I recognized it immediately. The cover was worn, the corners soft from being handled too many times. It showed the place we had always talked about, the one that lived more in our conversations than in our plans. I sat down at the table and unfolded it slowly. In that moment, something shifted. Not hope, not excitement. Just a quiet realization. The life I had been waiting to return to wasn't coming back. And if I didn't move forward now, I might never move at all. I left the brochure on the table longer than I meant to. At first, I told myself it was just nostalgia, a memory surfacing because I'd been cleaning, because grief has a way of pulling old things into the light when you least expect it. I folded it once, then unfolded it again, tracing the faded picture with my thumb as if it might change under my touch. It didn't. The place looked the same as it always had. Wide skies, old stone, a sense of distance that felt both inviting and impossible. I folded the brochure and put it back in the drawer. That should have been the end of it. But it was. Over the next few days, the thought kept returning, uninvited and persistent. It showed up while I was washing dishes, while I was standing in line at the grocery store, while I lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling and listening to the house breathe around me. I told myself it was ridiculous. People my age don't do things like that. Not alone, not after loss. We're supposed to settle, to shrink our worlds, not expand them, to find comfort in familiarity, not risk in the unknown. And yet, every time I tried to dismiss the idea, it came back slightly stronger, as if it had been waiting patiently all these years and was no longer willing to be postponed. I started remembering the conversations we'd had about it, not the serious ones but the small, passing remarks, how she'd pointed something out in a magazine, how she'd once said, half joking, "If we don't go soon, we never will," how I'd laughed and said, "There's plenty of time." Plenty of time. That phrase felt different now, heavy, almost accusatory. One afternoon, I took the brochure out again and set it on the table beside my coffee. I didn't open it right away. I just let it sit there, like a quiet companion. "What are you doing?" I asked myself out loud. The house didn't answer. I imagined what it would be like to go. The logistics alone felt overwhelming. Airports, luggage, schedules, a language I didn't speak. Even the idea of checking into a hotel alone made my chest tighten. I had never traveled alone before, not once. Every trip I'd ever taken had been shared. She handled the details I ignored. I followed her through unfamiliar places, trusting that she'd thought things through. Without her, the world felt larger in an uncomfortable way. I pictured myself getting lost, sitting alone in a restaurant, standing in a crowd with no one to turn to and say, "Did you see that?" The loneliness of it scared me more than the distance. And yet something inside me whispered back, quietly but firmly, "You are already alone." That thought stopped me cold. The truth was, I was lonely at home too. Lonely in familiar rooms. Lonely in routines that no longer led anywhere. Lonely in a life that felt paused, as if I were waiting for permission to move again. I didn't tell anyone about the idea at first. Not my children, not my friends. It felt too fragile, too easy to dismiss if spoken out loud. Instead, I started doing small things. I checked my passport. It was still valid, though just barely. I looked up flights, more out of curiosity than intent. I read articles about traveling later in life, skimming past the parts that talked about limitations and focusing on the ones that talked about possibility. At night, I imagined her reaction if I told her what I was thinking. She would have raised her eyebrows slightly, the way she did when she was surprised but pleased. Really, she would have said, "You." And then she would have smiled. That image stayed with me. It wasn't that I believed the trip would fix anything. I wasn't looking for healing or closure or some dramatic transformation. I just knew that staying exactly where I was felt like slowly disappearing. One evening, I sat at the table again with the brochure open in front of me and spoke aloud, my voice low in the empty room. "I don't know if I can do this." The words echoed softly. Then I added, quieter still, "But I don't know if I can keep not doing it either." That was the moment I realized the dream hadn't returned to haunt me. It had returned to ask something of me. And I didn't yet know what my answer would be. I didn't decide to go all at once. That's something people often misunderstand about big changes. They imagine a single dramatic moment, a realization, a declaration, a clear turning point. But for me, the decision came together slowly, in pieces, over many quiet days. I would wake up in the morning and feel certain I was being foolish. By afternoon, the idea would seem almost reasonable. By night, lying in bed with the lights off, it would feel necessary. Fear was the loudest voice. It spoke up immediately and often. It reminded me of my age, of my knees that didn't like stairs anymore, of the way my balance wasn't what it used to be. It reminded me of missteps, unfamiliar streets, wrong turns taken too late. It reminded me of everything that could go wrong. I listened to it carefully. Fear isn't always the enemy. Sometimes it's just information delivered too loudly. But there was another voice too, quieter, slower, harder to ignore once I noticed it. That voice asked what would happen if I didn't go. What would my days look like a year from now, 5 years from now, 10 if I was lucky? I pictured the same kitchen, the same chair, the same routines repeated until they no longer felt like stability but confinement. I pictured myself becoming smaller in ways that had nothing to do with my body. That thought frightened me more than airports ever could. I began making lists, not plans yet, just lists, things I would need to consider if I were going to do something like this. Medications, insurance, emergency contacts, comfortable shoes. The lists gave the idea shape, made it less like a fantasy and more like a problem that could be solved. Some evenings, I sat with the television on low, not really watching, just letting the sound fill the room while I scrolled through travel information. I learned about train systems, about places that were walkable, about times of year when crowds thinned and the pace slowed. I imagined myself there, moving slowly, deliberately, without needing to keep up with anyone. The idea surprised me. For the first time, traveling alone didn't sound like abandonment. It sounded like permission. Eventually, I told my children. Not because I wanted approval, but because keeping it secret had begun to feel dishonest. We were sitting at my daughter's table when I mentioned it, as casually as I could manage. "I've been thinking about taking a trip," I said. They both looked up at once. "A trip," my son repeated. "Like where?" I named the place. The silence that followed was immediate and heavy. "Alone?" my daughter asked. "Yes," I said. She frowned, concern rushing to the surface. "Dad, that's a big thing." "I know," I replied. "That's why I'm thinking about it." They exchanged a look. The same look I had seen so many times before when they were weighing whether something was reasonable or risky. "Are you sure," my son asked, "that this isn't too much right now?" "Right now." That phrase again, always suggesting that some future version of me might be better equipped to live. "I don't know when right is anymore," I said. "I just know that waiting hasn't worked very well." They didn't argue, they didn't forbid. They asked questions instead, practical ones, about safety, about accommodations, about communication. I answered them calmly, honestly. I could tell they were worried, but I could also tell they were beginning to understand that this wasn't a whim, it was a response. After that conversation, something inside me settled. Not confidence, not excitement. Commitment. I booked the ticket on a quiet afternoon when the house felt particularly still. I sat at the computer longer than necessary, double-checking everything, my hand hovering over the mouse before finally clicking confirm. When the screen refreshed and the reservation appeared, my chest tightened. There it was. A date, a destination, proof. That night I stood in the bedroom and opened the closet. I pulled out a suitcase we hadn't used in years. It smelled faintly of dust and old trips. I set it on the bed and stared at it for a long time. Packing alone felt strange. Every item I placed inside reminded me of how we used to do this together, how she would remind me of things I forgot, how she would roll clothes carefully to save space. I folded slowly, methodically. I placed her ring in the small pocket of the suitcase without thinking about it too much. Only later did I realize what I'd done. The night before I left, I slept poorly, not from panic, but from anticipation, the kind that keeps you hovering just below wakefulness, aware that something important is about to happen. In the early morning, I stood in the doorway of the house and looked back one last time before locking it. I didn't know what I would find out there. I only knew that staying had begun to feel like a kind of surrender. And I wasn't ready for that yet. The drive to the airport felt strangely familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. I had taken that road countless times before, usually with a purpose that felt shared, dropping someone off, picking someone up, returning home together. This time, the purpose was mine alone, and that made every mile feel slightly unreal, as if I were watching myself from a distance. Traffic lights changed, cars merged and separated. The radio played softly, but I couldn't tell you what song was on. My mind kept drifting, not backward exactly, but sideways, touching memories without settling on any one of them. The way she used to comment on billboards, how she'd always remind me where we parked, how she'd reach for my hand without thinking at red lights. When I parked the car and stepped out into the cool morning air, the reality of what I was doing finally caught up with me. The terminal rose ahead, all glass and movement and sound waiting just beyond the doors. I stood there for a moment with my suitcase beside me, my hand resting on the handle, grounding myself in its solid weight. This was the last, easy place to turn back. I told myself that if I waited too long, I would start inventing reasons not to go. My body already knew that. It was tense in a way that had nothing to do with age. I took a breath, squared my shoulders, and walked inside. The airport moved around me like a river. People flowed past with purpose, faces set in expressions of urgency or boredom, phones in hand, bags slung over shoulders. I felt slow by comparison, deliberate, careful not to be in anyone's way. At first, that made me self-conscious. Then I realized no one was paying attention to me at all. That realization settled something inside me. At the check-in counter, the woman asked for my passport and boarding pass. Her voice was calm, practiced. She didn't rush me when I fumbled briefly with my wallet. When she handed everything back, she smiled politely and said, "Have a nice trip." It was such a simple thing to say. And yet it caught me off guard. A trip, not an ordeal, not a mistake, a trip. I thanked her and moved on, holding my documents a little tighter than necessary. Security took longer than I expected. Lines stretched and shifted. I stood when I could, leaned when my legs demanded it, reminding myself that there was no prize for speed. When I finally passed through and collected my things, I felt an unexpected flicker of relief. Not because the process was over, but because I had navigated it on my own. I found my gate and sat down, choosing a seat near the window. Outside, planes moved with a calm precision that made the whole operation seem almost graceful. I watched baggage carts scurry along the tarmac, workers in bright vests signaling to one another, the quiet choreography of departures unfolding again and again. Families gathered nearby, children leaning against parents, couples murmuring to each other in low voices. I felt the absence of my wife then, sharply but not painfully. It was more like noticing a missing note in a familiar piece of music. When boarding began, I rose with the others and followed the line, my suitcase rolling obediently behind me. Inside the plane, I found my seat and settled in, placing my bag overhead with more care. Then strength, I took the window seat, as I always had when we traveled together. Habit, perhaps, or maybe I wanted to watch the world fall away. As the plane taxied, my heart beat faster, not from fear but from awareness. This was happening. I had crossed the threshold between intention and action, and there was no pretending otherwise now. When the wheels lifted from the ground, I felt it in my chest, a gentle but unmistakable shift. The city shrank beneath us, buildings turning into shapes, roads into lines. I pressed my forehead lightly against the window, watching as familiarity dissolved into distance. Up there, suspended between where I had been and where I was going, something loosened inside me. The grief didn't disappear. It stayed with me, quiet and watchful, but it no longer felt like an anchor dragging me backward. It felt like a companion, coming along because it always would, not because it was in charge. The flight passed in long, thoughtful stretches. I dozed and woke, looked out the window, let my thoughts wander without forcing them anywhere. I didn't try to distract myself. I didn't try to be brave. I just let the time pass. When we landed, the unfamiliarity rushed in all at once. The sounds were different. The rhythm of movement felt altered, slightly off from what I was used to. Signs appeared in languages I didn't understand, and for a moment I felt very old and very far from home. I reminded myself to slow down. I followed the crowd, pausing when I needed to, asking for help when the signs stopped making sense. Each small interaction reassured me in ways I hadn't expected. People answered kindly. No one sighed or rolled their eyes. They simply pointed, explained, waited. Outside the terminal, the air felt different on my skin. Cooler, sharper. I stood there for a moment with my suitcase, taking it in. The sky looked the same, but everything else felt new, and that alone made my pulse quicken. The ride to the hotel passed through streets that felt both ordinary and foreign. Buildings I'd never seen before slid past the window. I watched them with the curiosity of someone who had forgotten what it felt like to see a place without history attached to it. At the hotel, the room was smaller than I'd imagined, but clean and quiet. When the door closed behind me, the silence felt sudden, almost loud. I stood there for a moment, listening to it, feeling the weight of being truly alone in a place where no one knew my name. I unpacked slowly, placing each item with care, as if arranging my things might help me settle myself as well. When I took my wife's ring from my pocket and set it on the nightstand, I paused. I didn't feel the need to say anything out loud. Just knowing it was there felt enough. That night was difficult. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by unfamiliar sounds and the constant awareness of where I was. I woke more than once, disoriented, my heart racing until recognition returned. Each time I lay still and reminded myself that I was safe, that this was part of the choice I had made. Morning arrived gently. Light crept through the curtains, softer than at home, touching the walls in a way that felt almost tentative. I sat up and listened. Somewhere outside, voices drifted past, calm and unhurried. I opened the window and let the air in. Standing there, looking out at a place we had only ever talked about, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not excitement, not relief. Possibility. I hadn't known what I would find out there. That part was still true. The journey was only beginning, and I didn't pretend otherwise. But I knew something else now too. Leaving hadn't been an act of running away. It had been an act of staying alive. I stood there for a long time, longer than necessary, just breathing. The air carried sounds I didn't recognize, footsteps on stone, a distant bell, voices rising and falling in a rhythm that wasn't mine yet. I didn't rush to make sense of any of it. For once, there was no schedule pressing me forward, no one waiting for me to decide what came next. I dressed slowly, choosing comfort over appearance, and went downstairs with my suitcase left untouched in the corner of the room. I told myself I would only go out for coffee, something simple, something familiar enough to feel safe. Outside, the street was already awake. People moved with purpose but not urgency. I walked carefully, watching where I placed my feet, letting my eyes wander without forcing them to land on anything in particular. Every few steps, I noticed myself reaching instinctively toward my left side, the place where she would have been walking beside me. Each time, my hand fell back to my side. The cafe I chose wasn't special. That was part of its appeal. A small place with a narrow counter, a few tables, the smell of coffee strong enough to cut through the morning air. I hesitated at the door, suddenly unsure of the rules. Do I sit first? Do I order first? How does this work here? I watched what others did and followed along. When it was my turn, I pointed to what the person before me had ordered and said, quietly, "That please." The woman behind the counter smiled and nodded, sliding the cup toward me. I thanked her, the words coming out with an accent that didn't belong, and she smiled again as if it didn't matter. I sat alone at a small table near the window and wrapped my hands around the cup. It was hot, solid, real. Steam rose and disappeared just as quickly. For the first time since arriving, I wasn't thinking about where I was or where I was going. I was just there. People passed by outside, their lives brushing against mine without touching it. I watched an older couple walk past slowly, their arms linked. The sight didn't hurt the way I expected it to. It made me feel tender, grateful, aware of what I'd had and still carried with me. After coffee, I walked some more. I let myself get a little lost, trusting that I could find my way back. I asked for directions once, then again, each time surprised by how easily help came when I admitted I needed it. By midday, my legs were tired. I sat on a bench in a small square and watched the world move around me. Children chased each other in wide, careless arcs. Someone played music nearby, not for money, just because they could. The notes drifted through the air, imperfect and alive. I realized then that I wasn't waiting for the trip to mean something. It already did. The following days unfolded gently. I found a rhythm that suited me. Mornings out, afternoons resting, evenings wandering close to the hotel, close enough that the thought of getting lost didn't creep in. I learned which streets were easier on my knees, which benches caught the sun, which times of day felt too crowded, and which felt like they belonged to me. I ate alone without hurrying. At first, I felt the familiar tug of self-consciousness, the sense that I should justify my presence somehow. But that faded. No one cared. No one watched. The world didn't stop because I was on my own. One afternoon, while standing in a long, quiet corridor lined with old stone, I felt something unexpected tighten in my chest. This was the place, the one from the brochure, the one we had talked about in vague, hopeful terms for years. I stopped walking. The light fell just as it had in the picture, though no photograph could have captured the way the air felt, or the way the space seemed to hold its breath. The corridor stretched ahead of me, cool and dim, the stone worn smooth by centuries of footsteps that were not mine. The air carried a faint echo of sound, distant voices, the soft scrape of shoes. But inside this stretch, everything felt suspended, as if time had slowed out of respect for the place. This was it. The place we had pointed to in books, circled on maps, spoken about late at night when the future still felt wide open. Standing here now, I understood why we had been drawn to it. There was nothing grand about it in the way modern places try to impress you. Its power was quieter, patient. I took a few careful steps forward, my hand brushing the stone wall without thinking, grounding myself in its cool solidity. I half expected the moment to overwhelm me, to bring grief crashing back in full force. It didn't. Instead, I felt an ache deep, yes, but steady, manageable, the kind of ache that comes from love remembered, not loss alone. I stood there longer than I meant to, watching light shift across the floor, until someone nearby cleared their throat softly. "First time here?" a voice asked. I turned, startled, and saw a small group paused a few steps away, a guide and a handful of visitors waiting patiently, unsure whether to move past me. "Yes," I said after a moment, "it is." The guide smiled, gesturing gently down the corridor. "Take your time," he said. "Most people do." I nodded, grateful. When I finally stepped aside and let them pass, I realized something subtle but important. This moment wasn't asking me to mourn. It was asking me to continue. I let the group move ahead of me, their footsteps fading softly into the distance, and stayed where I was a moment longer. The corridor no longer felt heavy. It felt expectant, like a door left open. When I finally stepped forward, I followed the group at a respectful distance, not close enough to feel obligated, not far enough to feel alone. The guide's voice floated back now and then, pointing out details I would have missed on my own. A carving worn nearly smooth, a mark left by fire long ago, evidence that people had lived full lives here and then moved on just as quietly as they'd arrived. At the end of the corridor, the space opened up into a broad courtyard washed in light. The sudden brightness made me pause again. I blinked, adjusting, and that's when I noticed a woman standing off to the side, studying a plaque with exaggerated concentration, as if reading it twice might reveal something new. She glanced at me and smiled, the quick, polite smile of someone acknowledging another presence without expectation. "Beautiful, isn't it?" she said. "It is," I replied, "different than I imagined." She laughed softly. "That's what I keep saying, photos don't prepare you." We stood there for a moment, two strangers sharing the same thought from opposite ends of the world. She told me she was traveling with her sister, who had wandered off in search of a restroom and hadn't returned yet. I told her I was traveling alone. She didn't look at me with pity. She didn't ask why. She simply nodded, as if that information fit neatly into the world as it was. "That takes courage," she said. I shook my head. "It takes more not to." She considered that, then smiled again. We parted easily after that, no promises, no lingering. The interaction was small, but it stayed with me. Not because it meant anything lasting, but because it didn't have to. It was enough to be seen briefly, kindly, and then allowed to move on. Later that afternoon, I joined a small group for a guided walk through nearby streets. The guide spoke with enthusiasm that bordered on theatrical, but I didn't mind. I let the stories wash over me. Who lived here? Who left? Who returned decades later to see what remained? At one point, we stopped near a narrow staircase that climbed steeply upward. My legs protested at the sight of it, and I hesitated, weighing pride against practicality. "You can skip this part," the guide said gently, noticing my pause. "We'll meet you at the top." I nodded, relieved, and sat on a low wall to wait. From there, I watched the others climb, their laughter echoing briefly before disappearing. I didn't feel left behind. I felt appropriately placed. While I waited, an older man sat down beside me, breathing a little heavily. "Thought I still had it," he said with a chuckle. "Me too," I replied. We shared a look that said everything else. He told me he'd promised himself he'd see this place before his knees decided otherwise. I told him I understood that kind of promise. We sat there quietly until the group returned, neither of us rushing to stand. That evening, back near the hotel, I wandered into a small restaurant I hadn't planned on. The host gestured to a table I assumed was meant for one, but as I sat down, another man approached, gesturing to the empty chair. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. "Everything else is full." "Please," I said. We spoke in slow, careful phrases, filling in gaps with gestures and smiles when words failed. He told me about his work, his children, the city he called home. I told him about mine, leaving out the heavier parts without consciously deciding to. When the meal ended, he raised his glass slightly and said, "To being brave enough to leave home." I lifted mine in return. Walking back to the hotel that night, my steps felt lighter, not because grief had vanished, but because it had stopped being the only thing I carried. In the days that followed, these moments accumulated, not dramatically, just steadily: a shared bench, a missed turn that led somewhere unexpected, a conversation that ended without goodbyes. Each one reminded me of something I had forgotten. The world hadn't closed when my wife died. I had. And here, slowly, carefully, I was opening again. The following morning, I woke later than usual. At first, I didn't realize why that unsettled me. It wasn't the time itself, but the disorientation that followed. For a few seconds, I didn't know where I was. The ceiling looked unfamiliar. The light came from the wrong direction. My body felt heavier than it had the day before. I sat up slowly, waiting for the room to settle around me. It did eventually. The memory of where I was returned, followed closely by a wave of fatigue I hadn't felt before. Not sharp pain, not illness. Just a deep tiredness that seemed to come from somewhere older than muscle. I considered staying in that day. The thought surprised me with how reasonable it sounded. No one would know, no one expected anything of me, rest would be sensible, responsible. But another thought followed, just as quietly. I hadn't come all this way to retreat at the first sign of discomfort. I dressed carefully, moving slower than usual, and went downstairs. Outside, the sky had changed. Clouds hung low and heavy, and the air carried the promise of rain. The city felt different under that weight, more inward, less forgiving. I told myself I would keep things simple. That promise lasted about an hour. I walked farther than I planned to, drawn by a street I hadn't explored yet, then another beyond it. The ground sloped more than I realized, and by the time I noticed how far I'd gone, turning back felt more daunting than continuing. The rain started suddenly. Not a drizzle, a real downpour, the kind that soaks through coats and shoes before you have time to regret your optimism. People scattered for cover. I didn't move fast enough. By the time I reached an overhang near a closed shop, my legs were trembling, not just from exertion, but from the delayed recognition that I had pushed myself too far. I leaned against the wall, breathing harder than I liked, my heart beating in my ears. For the first time on this trip, fear rose sharply. Not fear of being lost, or embarrassed, or alone. Fear of my body failing me when I had no one nearby who knew my name. I stood there, rain hammering the pavement, trying to slow my breathing, when someone spoke behind me. "Are you all right?" I turned to see a woman holding an umbrella, her expression open but cautious. Not alarmed, just attentive. "I think I just need a moment," I said. She nodded and stepped closer, angling the umbrella to cover both of us without making a show of it. "There's a cafe just around the corner," she said. "Warm, you can sit." I hesitated, pride flaring briefly, then fading. "That would be good," I admitted. She walked at my pace, not faster, not slower. Inside the cafe, she guided me to a chair and ordered tea without asking, as if she knew that sometimes decisions are easier when they're taken from you gently. We didn't talk much while I recovered. She gave me space, pretending to read while keeping me in her peripheral vision. When my hands stopped shaking and my breathing steadied, she looked up. "Better?" she asked. "Yes," I said, and meant it. She smiled, satisfied, and went back to her book. When I eventually stood to leave, she looked up again. "Take care of yourself," she said. "I will," I replied. And for the first time since my wife died, I felt something unexpected. Gratitude not just for kindness, but for needing it. That evening, back in my room, I sat quietly and let the day replay itself. The fear, the help, the recovery. I realized then that this journey wasn't just about proving I could still do things alone. It was about learning when not to. The next days unfolded with more balance. I rested when I needed to. I planned routes instead of wandering endlessly. I still explored, but with a new respect for my limits. And somehow, that made everything richer. When the day came to leave, I didn't feel relief. I felt reluctance. Packing was easier this time, not because I had fewer things, but because I knew what mattered. The brochure went back into the suitcase, creased and softened even more now. My wife's ring stayed in my pocket, where it had been for most of the trip. At the airport, I moved with less hesitation. I knew what to expect now: the lines, the waiting, the way time stretches and compresses in transit. On the plane, I took the window seat again. As the ground fell away, I didn't press my forehead to the glass this time. I leaned back and closed my eyes, letting the hum of the engines carry me. When I returned home, the house greeted me with the same quiet as before. But it didn't feel the same. I set my suitcase down and stood in the doorway for a long moment, not because I was overwhelmed, but because I was aware of something new. I hadn't escaped this place. I had expanded it. The silence no longer felt like an ending. It felt like a pause between chapters. At 74, I traveled alone for the first time. Not to outrun grief, not to reinvent myself, but to remember that even after loss, life still asks something of us. And that sometimes answering means stepping forward, slowly, carefully, and with your heart still open.